Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the QT2 Systems webinar on how do I qualify for the Boston Marathon, the Fall Races edition. My name is Reem, Jishi, and I'm a coach with QT2 and the Run Formula, and a longtime runner. And this is just a fun topic for me. I've done this webinar in the past, but it's focused on the spring and summer races. But by far, the vast majority of the people who qualified for the Boston Marathon qualified during fall races. So I wanted to do a separate webinar that focuses on those races. So today, here's the basic presentation overview. So I'm going to talk about the qualification standards that are currently in place, the factors to consider in picking a qualifying race, and then go through my top 10 qualifying races, and then another 5 that are pretty high up on the list. And then finish off with some race day tips. So how you maximize your performance on race day in order to hopefully get the qualification spot that you are looking for. So just starting out by setting the stage. So we're looking right now at the 128th Boston Marathon coming up in April of 2024. So it's obviously too late to be looking at 2023. So this presentation will focus on 2024 and 2025, because for the most part, fall races, you've already run them for 2024. So, but we will look at the fall races for people who are interested in qualifying for 2025, but then everything else in here is relevant for this coming year as well. So just as a general rule, I mean, in order to participate in the Boston Marathon, you either have to qualify, and that can either be a time qualification, or you can have run 10 or more Boston Marathons to apply through this area, or you need to represent an official charity partner. And in 2023, there were 42 charity partners that participated. So you can run as part of a team. Makes up charity groups, roughly 20% of the field. Or it's by special invitation in here. That's mostly the professionals or other invitations. The qualifying race has to be run for this. Now, this is for the 2024 Boston Marathon, has to be run between September 1st of 2022, and the end date, the specific end date has not yet been announced. That will be announced after this year's Boston Marathon, but it has in the past coincided with the conclusion of registration. So that will likely be in mid-September of this year, but we will have more details probably around June of this year. Okay, so more on setting the stage here. The registration for 2023, this just gives you a sense of the timeline. For 2023, the registration window opened on Monday, September 12th at 10 a.m. and it closed on Friday, September 16th at 5 p.m. So any athlete, and this was new for the last few years, is that any athlete who has a qualifying time can submit their application at any time during this window. It is not on a first come, first served basis. Whether you are ultimately accepted or not accepted into the Boston Marathon will depend on your time, how many people applied, how many slots were open, and how your time stacks up relative to the other people who applied. But if you have achieved the qualification time, then you can go ahead and apply during this time. For the 2023 Boston Marathon, the qualifier acceptances were announced on September 21st. So it's a pretty quick process. This also lines up with the charity timeline. And for the 2023 Boston Marathon, they started accepting applications for charities on that same day, on September 12th. So everything runs around the same time, and then announcements get made in June, roughly. That's at least what happened this year. Okay, so the current qualifying standards, and these will apply for 2024, these are set out. These were new as of the 2020 marathon was supposed to have been the first year. That marathon ultimately did not take place, but these new qualification standards went into place for that event. And that was lowering of 5 minutes from what was in place before. What is new now is, as of for the 2023 marathon, they added for qualification cutoffs for non-binary athletes. They are, as you can see, they just mirror the women's times right now. BAA has indicated that it's something that they'll be reviewing and continue to update as more data is available. But as of now, these are the qualification standards. Okay, so I want to spend a little time talking about the qualifying history of the race. So in the first column, we look at the last decade of races, and the field size is it's gone up and down. It was at 36,000 in 2014, and then it sat at 30,000 until then 2020, the number got bumped up to 1,500 in 2021, which was the fall race, the post-COVID race. The field size, the during COVID race, my apologies, the field size was dropped to 20,000. And that kind of had a ripple effect in terms of cutoff time and number of people who were not accepted. But then now for the last two races for 2022 and 2023, everyone who applied was accepted. And I will go through that in a little more detail. But as you'll see here, the number, so in 2019, the cutoff time was 4:52. So that meant, for example, if your qualification time was 3 hours, in order to be given a spot to actually run the Boston Marathon, you needed to be a 2:55:08. So it was getting, so BAA decided that they're going to lower that. So instead of a 3-hour qualifying time, that went to a 2:55 qualifying time. So going into 2020, with also having a larger field size, the expectation is that anyone who applied was going to get in that year. As it turned out, a lot of people applied. And so there still ended up being a qualification cutoff of 139. And then in 2021, as I mentioned, the field size was smaller. And so a number of people were rejected there. And I'm going to break this down a little more by the numbers. So just starting with 2023. So the number of people who applied, 23,267 runners. And in general, over the years, qualifying runners who participate with a qualifying time make up 80% of the field. So if you've got a field of 30,000 runners, 24,000 of those spots are going to be left open to runners for qualifying time. So you see the number was under 24,000. Everyone is accepted. No one was rejected, assuming that their time could be validated. So long as you ran under your qualifying time, you were in for 2023. So similar for 2022, the number was actually slightly fewer runners that applied, but again, everyone that applied was accepted. And if we look at now 2021, so this is now the field that had a 20,000 cut. So the number who applied, 23,824, if it had been a normal year in terms of numbers with a 30,000 person field, then anyone who applied in 2021 likely would have been accepted. So there would have been a 0 cutoff that year. But because it was a different situation, a number of people were not accepted. 40% or so of the field was not accepted that year. And so that sort of, I think, panicked people a lot because you had to be so far under in order to be able to run that year. So looking back to 2020, and this is the race that wasn't run, you had more than 24,000 people apply. But as you'll see, the accepted number, it's slightly more than 24,000. Like, so although Boston says that, yeah, I should go back on the slide. Also, although Boston says it has a number of 30,000, the actual field sizes aren't exactly 30,000. Like, so they're a little above, and here it's probably because a number of people like apply and are 1 second under or 2 seconds late, and so they can't like not accept multiple people that have the exact same time. So I think that that's where you'll see some numbers be up or down, and they just need to pick a cutoff. So And that is basically the qualifying history. We obviously don't know for 2024 how many people are going to apply. What I can say is that so far, if you look at the top 10 races which have taken place so far, roughly 16,000 runners have qualified already to take part in the 2024 race. How many of them actually apply, and how many of those are actually, like, someone might have appear in multiple races as a qualifier? So I can't say with that. But time will tell how many people end up applying for 2024. So in picking a qualifying race, there's a number of factors that you should consider, and there's no right answer here. You'll see later, I'm going to go through the top 10 qualifying races, but you can qualify at virtually any race you want. And so there's a number of things that you need to consider to make the best decision for you. So the first one is that the course just needs to be certified. So it either needs to be certified by US Track and Field or a similar international entity, just to say that it's 26.2 miles. And then it needs to meet other qualification standards. And these are really pretty basic. Have to have 3 or more competitors. It needs to be promoted prior to race day. There has to be a timing chip, and it needs to be outdoors. So you can't just grab a friend, run a marathon on indoor track and, call it a day and say that that counts. So, but they're pretty minimal. So pretty much any race that you sign up for is going to be qualifying, but make sure you check when you sign up for the race that they state that it's a Boston qualifier, just to cover yourself. You don't want to run a race, get a time, and then have it not count. So that's just one thing to check. The next factor to consider is the date. And here, for the most part, it's when is a good time for you to run. If you live, I think that a lot of the qualifying races happen in the fall, because for a lot of people, the summer is the best time to train. And so they hit a fall race. It's a great time of year for a race because of weather conditions. But if you live in Florida, for example, you might be better off with a January race or a March race than you are with an October race. So I think it's the date that works out the best for you, given where you live, your life circumstances, the timing of when you're available to train. One other thing that for some people, they can't race on Sundays, so you want to look, for a Saturday race. But there are so many races out there that it shouldn't be a problem being able to find one that works within your guidance. The next one I'm going to just talk about is the number of runners. And this is, I think, also a personal preference here. So the big races, and you'll see as we go through the list, the top qualifier races, a lot of them are very big races. Big races have their benefits. They have a lot of energy. They've got great crowd support. They have really good on-race support, so you don't have to worry about your nutrition on it. Everything's taken care of. The logistics are smooth. But the downside to a big race is that oftentimes the race morning logistics are tough. Your day starts a heck of a lot earlier than the race actually starts, with New York City being probably the prime example, Boston Marathon being, another one where your race morning logistics get very difficult. You also are more likely to overrun the course on a big race because of dodging around other runners or not being able to take the best line. So there's pros and cons, and those are just things, no right answer or wrong answer. It's just, something that you want to think about. If a race is too small, on the other hand, you might not have other runners out there that are running your pace, if that's important to you. If you're a really good solitary runner, then, signing up for a marathon that has 70 runners may be perfect for you. But if you're someone that likes to feed off of the people around you, then you might not want a small race. The small races also are not going to have the same kind of support on the course. So you may need to carry more nutrition with you, and then assume that your water stops aren't going to be as close together. So that's just on the flip side of it. So I think my personal take is that the sweet spot falls somewhere in that 8,000 runner range. But again, this is a personal choice and just things that that you should consider as you're picking a race. The next one is the weather. Weather is going to make a difference. Ideal marathons tend to be run in the low to mid 40s. It's still pretty good up until the mid to upper 50s. After that, then you're going to just your times are going to start suffering from it. High humidity, you'll suffer. Wind on a course may be an issue as well that impacts things. If if you live somewhere warm and you're racing somewhere cold, that's another thing, you know, to consider, because it's best to be able to race and train in similar environments. Another factor to consider is whether the course is a one-way, out and back, looped turns. And here, a one-way course has a couple things to consider here. One is that the race morning logistics can be more complicated because you need to be shuttled somewhere. So that often adds time to the day. And a one-way course is also going to be impacted by wind, favorably or not. Like it could be head or cross or tail, but wind on the day is going to have more of an impact on a one-way course. An out and back course is one that's really easy, I think, for race organizers to put together. You can double up on fueling stops. Some people really like out and back. Some people don't like them at all, especially when you're still going out and people are coming back. Sometimes that can be tough, but again, just something to consider. A looped course is, you know, it's one loop, two loops. Again, you just need to look at what it is. And then one that applies to any type of course is the number of turns on a course. The more turns that there are in a course, the more likely you are to overrun the course. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The next point to mention is terrain. Do you want a flat race? Do you want a hilly race? Do you like rollers? And hilly races tend not to be the races that you hit PRs on. You have several, the runs that are the top qualifying races or the downhill races that have, you know, 4,000 feet elevation drops. Those are definitely quicker than if you had to do a 4,000 foot elevation gain on the same course. So just something there to consider as well. Road surface, I think all the races on the list are all on road. So they're on the road rather than being on hard pack, because it tends to be a quicker surface. This next one is the start time. Some races start at 10, some races start at 6. When does your body work the best? What time do you want to start? Sometimes they start really early, either because of crowds on the street or to try to beat the heat. But if you normally run at 6 in the morning, if the race starts at 10, that may be challenging, or vice versa. The next one is vibe, and this is just the overall feel to the race. And this is kind of the big race, small race. Do you like something that has a lot of energy to it? Do you like something that's more low key? What's your, how do you want to feel when you get to the start line? And look for a race that matches that. Whether the race has pacers. And this is, again, a real personal preference. So pacers are ideal if you want to make sure maybe that you start out the race a little slower. So you hook yourself into a pace group that's running a little slower than you want, and it kind of forces control a little bit. It's good if you like to be motivated and run with people around you, but pacers are every race. I mean, you have to look at how the pacer is set up, if they're pacing by even effort, by even pace, if they're doing run walk intervals. So you need to look at that. I did a race last year where the pacer was a little faster than pace time, and he never stopped. I stayed with him for 15 miles and never stopped to get water, to get nutrition, to do nothing. So that made it actually really tricky, because I wanted to stop and pick things up. So I had to run to the front of the group so that I was able to grab the nutrition I want and fall to the back of the group and hold on. And that, to me, that was a tough pacer. So after 15 miles, I said, you know, I'm just going to run this on my own, because that stopped working for me. But it can be a really positive thing, and pacers are available in most large races. The course support. And this goes again with big race, small race. So on the big races, you'll see hydration stops every mile. You'll see you'll often see water and a sports drink on there. You'll see nutrition products, see fruit on the course. You've got your medical, your porta-johns, your all, like anything that you possibly need is going to be out there for you. And that's a nice thing to have. So you don't have to worry about carrying as much as of your own stuff. The logistics, and this is kind of like the race morning. How do I get there? What do I need to do? What's it involved with, bag check and things like so. The bigger races tend to have more logistics oriented with them. The next factor is concurrent races. So several races that are out there now have another race that's going on at the same time, like a half marathon. And the half marathon may start with the marathon, it may join, it may end with the marathon, it may start and then rejoin later. And that's something from a psychological standpoint, I think that's important to consider, because if you are running, let's say you're out there, you're targeting an 8-minute mile, you're running with the half marathoners, and 12 miles into the race, the half marathoners go off and finish the race. And then now all of a sudden, all those people that you're running with are gone. Like that definitely has an impact. And that's something to think about in deciding. On the flip side, sometimes you have like the Baltimore Marathon. I don't know if it's still like this, but it used to be that the half marathon starts halfway through. So when you're dealing with those last 6 miles on the marathon, where life can get pretty tough, all of a sudden you have all these really fresh people, they're still pretty fresh at their half marathon point, passing you. And how does that feel? And so it's a factor to consider and look at when you're trying to pick a race. And then the last one is it's just location. Where do you want to race? Is it close to home? Is it far away? Is it in a similar climate? Do you want to make a trip out of it? That's, just another factor to look at. Okay. So now we're going to jump to the top 10 for 2024. So if you look on the BAA website, it includes right there a list of the top qualifying races. And most of those races, as I mentioned at the beginning, most of those races occur in the fall or early winter. So between September and January is when most of the races take place. The most notable exception to that is the Boston Marathon itself, which roughly a third to 40% of the field that raced the Boston Marathon requalify for the next year. So that's the biggest qualifying race out there, is the Boston Marathon. There's some other exceptions, including the Eugene Marathon, which is in early May, Grand Mas Marathon, which is mid-June. Those are two historically high qualifying races. In the presentation that I did that focus on spring and summer races, I go through those races as well as other ones that are good qualifiers. But said the vast majority of people who qualify are qualifying during the fall and early winter. So this is the top 10 for 2024. The top 6 on this list will appear maybe in a different order, but they will appear every year. Those races always qualify a high number of people. The percentages, the numbers are going to change, but you're always going to see them. The ones below are on there for 2024. They're not necessarily on for 2023 or 2022, but they will be. Maybe they're not in the top 10, but they'll still be in the top 20 or 25. So they still remain solid qualifying races. So this list comes from the findmymarathon.com website with the numbers just in order, and they're listed based on the actual number of people from the race, not the BQ percentage, but the number of people who qualify. And I'm going to go through each of these in more detail, but you'll see that for 2024, Chicago has, by far the biggest number of qualifiers in this group. Now, Chicago is always a high qualifier, but 2024, the 2023 race was these races were done in the fall of 2022 or early 2023. That's when these races were done. The fall of 2022 at the Chicago Marathon, the weather was ideal. The times were really fast. And on the flip side, the New York City Marathon, which usually qualifies more people than this, the weather was really warm at the New York City Marathon this year. So times were slower. So that's where you're going to see ups and downs. The CIM and Philadelphia Marathon, Indianapolis Marathon, Houston, they all sit roughly at these numbers each year. Okay, so I'm going to go through these now, starting with number 10 on the list and just walking through some of the factors that I talked about, things to consider. So Twin Cities Marathon, which is from Minneapolis to St. Paul, Minnesota. It's in October, 8 o'clock start. It is a point-to-point race, so you do have some logistics to deal with by doing that. It's rolling hills, so nothing like no huge climbs or anything like that, but not pancake flat either. It's on pavement. One of the time of this and the location often makes the temperature at the start really ideal at 44 at the start, and getting up to 61 is the high for the day. So for a lot of people who are looking for BQ times, you're done by noon. And so the temperature stays fairly mild there, ideal for a race. And it's the only event that's going on. So you don't have the complications of another race. So in 2022, you had 6,500 finishers, and of those 513 qualified, so just around 8% of the field. Okay, so and the data that I am giving you for all these slides comes from both Find My Marathon and then the actual website for the race. So that's where this is being pulled from. So number 9 on the list for and I have the wrong second. So the dates that I'm giving you, let me just correct this here. So the date that I'm giving you is for this coming year. So if you are now looking to qualify for the 2025 Boston Marathon, these are the races that you might want to consider. Okay. So St. George Marathon will take place on October 7th of this year, an earlier start at 7. It's in St. George. And for this is a point-to-point race with a net downhill. So again, you're dealing with some logistical issues in terms of how to get there. You've got shuttles to the start. The St. George race with a 2,500 foot, just over 2,500 feet net loss it's a downhill race. This one starts out downhill for the first 7 miles, has some rolling miles in the middle, and then starting at about mile 12, it's pretty much all the way downhill to the finish line. So the one comment I'm going to make on, if you pick a downhill race that has this kind of net drop, you better work on training those quads and get them really strong, because a race like this will beat the heck out of you. Maybe you'll make it fine through the race, but you won't be walking for a few weeks after. So I would definitely add that to your list of training if you're going to focus on a downhill race. The weather in St. George is warmer. It's definitely higher than is ideal at that time on average. It is the only event, so you don't have the extra complication. And roughly in 2022, you had 521 qualifiers or 15% of the field at that race. Okay, so number 8, Marine Corps Marathon. This one will be on October 29th of this year. Has around an 8 a.m. start, Washington, D.C., single loop, mostly flat, road and pavement, mean temperature's pretty good. It can be on the higher side, but Halloween in D.C., I mean, it could be colder, it could be warmer. That's a lot less predictable. Marine Corps Marathon has 2 races that are also run on that day. The one that's important is the 15K, which starts sooner than it starts 40 minutes before the full marathon, and it starts at the same place, but then there's a detour at just before mile 5. So there's a detour starting at mile 4.5, and it adds the extra, like just under 5 miles. So what will happen is that although the 50K people will start soon, the fields are going to converge together at some point in that race, and they will get mixed. The 50K is a much smaller field, and because of where it joins, it's probably not like a big issue on race day, but there is that second race going on. And there is also a 10K, but the timing shouldn't overlap in a way that would matter to the marathon. So for 2022, just over 11,000 finishers, 544 qualifiers, so about a 5% BQ. Okay, so number 7 was the REVEL Big Bear Marathon. And if you see the word REVEL in the title of a race, it means it is a net downhill race, and a pretty steep one at that. So there's a number of REVEL races that make it on the top list, different times of year. So this year will be in November, and an early start. It's in Redlands, California, point to point, and a really, strong downhill, 5,000 plus feet net loss, which is just a huge net loss. It's on road and pavement. It's again probably a little warmer at the start. This one does have a half marathon that's going on at the same time. but both races start at 6 a.m. So the half marathon on the marathon will overlap for the quickest people in the marathon and the back part of the field of the half marathon. You'll see some overlapping, but for the most part, the race is open. Also doesn't have a huge number of runners and only 1,600 runners. So it won't get too crowded there, but it does, you see, has a really high BQ rate given, the number of finishers. There's quite a few qualifiers from this race. Okay, so number 6, now we're going into the 6 that always appear on the list. So Houston Marathon was in January, so it's coming up January 15th of 2024, about a 7 o'clock start time, Houston, Texas. Single loop, completely flat, on road, and the mean temperature at the start of 46 degrees puts it in the ideal area. There is a concurrent race going on with the Houston Marathon. In this case, it's the half marathon. They start together, and then the half marathon branches off at mile 7.5 and then rejoins at mile 24. So this is going to be a place where at the beginning that you may be running with a bunch of people who branch off partway through the race. So, and then I said rejoin at the end. So you have overlap in both parts of the race. But this year in the 2023 race, you had just over 6,000 finishers and 911 qualifiers. So it's got a good percentage. Okay, so next one, number 5, the Indianapolis Monumental Marathon. And this one for this coming year is on November 19th, 8 o'clock start in Indianapolis. It's mostly a loop course. There's some out and back sections. It's mostly flat. So some some gradient variation, but not a lot. It's on road pavement. Mean temperature is pretty ideal at 42, an average of 42 at the start. And Indianapolis, very similar to Houston, has a half marathon that starts at the same place. And I mean, they both start at the same time, same starting line, and they run together just past mile 7. And then the half rejoins the full towards the end at mile 23.5. So really, really similar to Houston here. And this one, the stats from 2022, 4,600 finishers and 938 qualified for Boston. So a 20% BQ rate at Indianapolis. Okay, so moving to Philadelphia Marathon. Philadelphia used to be run with the half and the full on the same day. That changed a few years ago, and now the full marathon is the only one on that date. The date for this year is November 19th, 7 o'clock start in Philadelphia, mostly loop, mostly flat. There is some definite gradient variation on the Philadelphia course, but it's not known to be a really challenging course. It's on road pavement, and the temperatures are it's late fall in Philadelphia, so they're usually pretty good. I think if I remember right, it was very cold this year in Philadelphia, so you never really know, what you're going to get. But this is the mean temperature over the past, I think it's 5 years. So like I said, it's the only event for 2022. There are 8,400 finishers, 1,180 qualifiers, so about a 14% rate for this past year. Okay, CIM, and this is historically one of the top qualifiers. It's December race, so it's a little later in the season, December 3rd this year, 7 o'clock start, and it's a point-to-point from Folsom to Sacramento. Net downhill, but not a huge one. But there is a net elevation loss on this one. It's on the road. Mean temperature is pretty ideal at that 46 start temperature. It is the only event going on that day. There is a relay, but it's pretty much a split in there. So you're not dealing with any shorter events that are mixed in there. It's being a point-to-point race. There are shuttles to the start, and that adds a couple hours onto your race morning time, just getting there. But historically, every year the BQ rate is sitting in there somewhere around 30%. So it's definitely a good race to look at. And so for 2022, 8,100 finishers and then 2,558 qualifiers, so a 32% BQ. Okay, so number 2 for the 2024 Boston Marathon was New York City Marathon, which took place in November 2022. For this year coming up, it'll be November 5th, 2023. 9:10 start, but that's a big if. So 9:10, the first wave's at 9:10, the final wave was at 11:30 this year. Everyone has to get to the start of the New York City Marathon well in advance of the start of the race. So this is one of those point-to-point races where you may be leaving wherever you're staying overnight 5 or more hours before the event starts. So the logistics in New York are pretty tough. And you're sitting out in Staten Island outdoors. It may be really hot. It may be really cold. There's things to worry about in terms of your fueling and getting things right and staying at a good temperature before the start of the race. But New York is such a fun race. It's a challenging course for sure. It says rolling hills, but I think anyone who's run New York knows that there's actually some pretty big hills in the marathon. Finishing in Central Park is challenging, although exhilarating. And so New York certainly has its challenges this year. So the mean temperature at the start is 52, but New York has had some very cold years. And then this year was an exceptionally hot year. So times at New York were slow. So the qualification number for this year at 5% was low. Usually you see that number at more like 7 to 9%. So we're seeing more in the range of like 3,500 qualifiers rather than the 2,500 that we saw this year. But still, it's a big event. You get a lot of qualifiers that come out of it just from it being a big event. Okay, so number one qualifying race to date for the 2024 Boston Marathon was Chicago last year. And as I mentioned at the start, the temps at Chicago were perfect. They were in the mid 40s to start, really quick pacing. And so the BQ rate at Chicago this year was 15%, so high. Over the past 5 years, the average rate is closer to 10% up and down, so 15 this year was definitely on the high side. But that said, Chicago will always be a good qualifying race. It's always going to be in the top 10. It's a really fun race. It's a single loop. It's flat. And, temperatures can be ideal there. So the next 5, I just want to mention a few because I said the top 6 are always on the list. Those numbers that were 7 to 10 will appear on somewhere in the top 25 every year, but may not appear in the top 10 any given year. So these are the next ones that show up pretty regularly as top qualifying races. So the Mesa Marathon in Arizona, Columbus Marathon in Columbus, Ohio, another REVEL race, the Big Cottonwood Marathon in Utah, Wineglass Marathon, which is in upstate New York, and then the Erie Marathon in Erie, Pennsylvania. And Erie is one that tends, Erie and also Big Cottonwood are ones that tend to be multiple year qualifiers. So if you remember, the qualifying window opens September 1st and it closes somewhere in mid-September. So those first couple of weekends in September, you can qualify for 2 years based on that. And you can use the same race to qualify for both years. So there's some like that early September could work out for you double, but those ones on here tend to be high qualifying races too. Okay, so that's all for the specific races I'm going to cover. I want to turn next to some race day notes. So now you made it, you picked your race, you figured it all out, you've done all your training, and now how are you going to approach the race so to maximize your chance? So your first question is, how are you going to pace? And you can pace any number of ways, right? You can pace based on heart rate, based on power, based on pace, based on perceived exertion. You can start out conservative and build. You can, try to negative split. You can start out easy, try to go even paced or even effort after that. You can try to accumulate time at the beginning and hope that you can hold on. Really think through whatever your pacing strategy is before you go into it, and then stick to your plan. Just make sure you think about it. In the Find My Marathon on their website, that you can run various different types of pacing that are very course specific. So that's a really good tool to be able to use. That'll tell you, okay, if you want to start out conservative start and the course is hilly, like it will go step by step every mile and give you some indication of what the pacing could be. If you're pacing by power, then you've just got your numbers, or heart rate, you have the numbers in front of you. So I'm not going to say what the right or wrong way is. People are unique in what works with them, but just know whatever it is that you like to do, make sure that you've thought about it in advance and you have a plan going in. Are you going to do a run walk approach? If you've trained using a run walk approach, then you probably want to race that way, at least through most of the race. And that approach may be that you just walk through your fuel stations. That may be it, but that's something that you obviously need to decide before you go into the race and have a plan. Do you want to run with pace groups? We talked about that at the beginning on some of the pros and cons of being running in a pace group for some or all of the race. And then the last one I'm going to say is, do you want to run your best race or do you want to run a BQ? And where this comes into play the most is for the people who are on the bubble. So who are trying to hit, let's say, that 3-hour mark, and their training indicates that they may be able to run a 3:01 or a 3:02. If they run a 3:02, they're not going to qualify. If they try to run a 2:59, they may blow up and run a 3:20. So this is something that you just want to think about before what your objective of your race is. If it's worth it to you, if your sole goal is to try to get a BQ, then you might take more risks and know that you might blow up never getting there. If your goal is to just race your best race, then you might be approaching it differently. So that's just something to consider. The next thing is overrunning the course. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people have their Garmin tell them that they met their BQ time, but their official race time is a few minutes higher. And that often, if you go back and look at your numbers, you see that people ran 26.4, 26.6, 27 miles. If you are overrunning the course, when we pace assuming we're going to run the distance. And so this is a situation where I'm going to give you things to minimize your likelihood of overrunning the course, but it's also something that you might want to consider. When I write pace plans now for athletes, I write them based on them running 26.4 miles. I assume that they're going to overrun the course because it's really, really hard not to, especially if it's a course, if you're running in a bigger race where you can't always take the tangent that you want to. So some things just to try to minimize how much you overrun is to run the tangent. When they measure a race, when they certify it based on the shortest line. If it's an S curve and you follow the outsides of the curve, you're running a way longer line than if you're cutting straight through the middle. You can cut straight through the middle if it's not a crowded field. If it's a crowded field, you're going to end up running longer, and that's just the way that it's going to happen. So, but that said, it's important to know how a race gets measured. It's important to practice running tangents. So to go out there and look at your turns and try to cut them as tight as you can to minimize your run time, so that when it comes to the race, even if you can't always take that best line because there's too many runners around, you know when there's opportunities to try to shorten your line and make the most and run as little as possible more than you have to. The other time where this comes up is when you're passing runners. Every time you step to the right, pass, come back to the left, you are adding time. You're not only taking energy by speeding up and slowing down, but you're adding distance. And that may not seem like a lot, but over the course of 26.2 miles and you pass 100 runners by moving around them, you're just going to add time to your distance to your day. And this also works on the aid stations. If you like to run the left side of the course and the aid station's on the right, every time you cut across to go to an aid station, you're adding. And, other things in here, if you want to see if you've got a family member or friend that are out there cheering for you and you want to high five them, you're adding distance. And just to be aware of that piece of it. Okay, some other notes is when you are figuring out what your pacing is, you want to think about the time that it's going to take you to do some other things on the course, right? So if you are you going to be slowing down when you go through an aid station? You always want to make sure that you're taking in your nutrition and your hydration. Can you do that while you're running without slowing down your speed? Ideally, yes, but that takes practice. So something that you're going to want to work in your practice is practicing picking up a cup and drinking while you run, or taking down your gel without losing speed. If your strategy is that you're going to walk through aid stations, then make sure you're factoring that in when you do your pacing plan and a lot for that time. So this is like taking walk breaks, whether they're planned, sorry, I should say planned or unplanned. So sometimes we walk because we're walking through an aid station, or we're doing a 9-1 schedule or whatever, it's planned. Then you can figure that out, and you can do like your pace plan can have, this is when I'm running, this is what my pace needs to be when I'm walking, this is what my pace needs to be, and you know how long it's going to take. But sometimes we have unplanned stops, right? Something comes up, you have to walk, your shoe gets untied, you have like you're taking a break because you need to use the porta-john, and that takes time. So there's things that come up along the way that are that can potentially slow you down. Family hugs, high fives, that kind of thing. I mean, they may not take much time, but they can add up. And if you're on the bubble, can make a difference between qualifying or not qualifying. Nutrition and hydration. I'm not going to spend any time really talking about what a good diet is to fuel you. We have the core diet as part of our group at QT2 Systems. If you need help with your nutrition, then definitely reach out there. But what you eat matters. I mean, I can, that I can say pretty with certainty. But then on race day, focusing here, what's your plan? So hopefully you have a race fueling plan, whether it's one that's created for one you've developed yourself, but you have a plan. How much do you need to drink? How often are you going to drink? What are you going to take in from extra nutrition? Make sure that you have a plan and that you've practiced it. And this includes the piece of, are you going to be able to take fuel in while you're running? That's a piece of it too. But whatever your plan is, practice it when you train and follow it on race day. If the temperatures are much hotter than you've been used to, then that plan may need to be adjusted to take in more fuel to increase your sodium intake. And that's something that if you do have a fueling plan that you've worked with a registered dietitian on that, and the temperature is hotter than you're used to doing, then you want to talk and make sure that there's any modifications that are needed so that on race day, you are fueling. Fueling is an area that we have complete control over, and an area that most people mess up all the time. So do your homework, make sure you have the plan, and then follow it on race day, and don't let that interfere with your pacing. Okay. Final slide here is some race day notes. So as much as we plan and hope that everything we did is going to get us somewhere, sometimes things happen and you show up to the starting line and you're not where you want to be for it. And these are things like if you were planning on qualifying and you got injured and you had to miss, 4 weeks of training leading up to it, your goal of qualifying may not be as realistic unless you are way, way, way under and you are healed and you can still somehow get through it. But you may have to evaluate what your potential is if you have to take a significant amount of time. If you're currently injured, you need to think about what kind of damage you can do to your body to be able to actually push through the race, and if it makes sense. Other things, weather, like New York City this year. I think a lot of people had goals in New York City that just became very unrealistic given what the weather conditions were that day. So we can't control everything, but we can control how we respond and the decisions we make based on information. So just some things to keep in mind as it. But so I'm going to stop my screen share now. And I want to invite anyone, if you have any questions, to go ahead and put them in the chat box, or feel free to come off mute and ask anything if you do. Spent the better part of an hour talking, so. All right, here's the fun countdown. All right, so I don't see any questions. If anyone does, please feel free to reach out to me at reem@qt2systems.com. Happy to answer any questions. And this has been recorded today. It will be up on our YouTube channel by later this evening. So good luck, everyone, on your goals. And I hope to see you at the Boston Marathon.